Welcome to Deep Dive. Are our lives set in stone from the moment we're born? Does destiny truly exist, or, do we carve our own paths with every choice we make? This is a question humanity has wrestled with for millennia, really, through religion, philosophy, and now, increasingly, science. For this deep dive, we've gathered some truly fascinating perspectives to explore this eternal dilemma. Our mission is basically to unpack these different viewpoints, pull out the most important insights, and help you, our listener, get a clearer handle on what these big ideas might mean for your own life, your choices.
It's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It touches everyone. And what's so interesting here is how these different ways of looking at it, spiritual, philosophical, scientific, they often seem to clash, right? But sometimes they actually overlap in some really surprising, profound ways. We'll explore how each lens sees this whole concept of destiny.
Okay, so let's start there. The many faces of destiny. How have different, say, spiritual or religious traditions tackled this?
Well, from a spiritual or religious angle, many traditions absolutely hold that destiny exists. Often the belief is that, everything happens for a reason. There's some kind of divine plan or a higher purpose guiding things. Some parts of life might be seen as just written, unchangeable, while other parts, maybe they're left more open for us to decide.
So it's not always presented as completely fixed. Like some things are set, others are more flexible.
Exactly. That's a common thread. So, for instance, in some Christian traditions, there's this strong sense that God has a unique purpose for every single person guiding their path. And similarly, if you look at Eastern philosophies like Hinduism or Buddhism, you've got the concept of karma. It's deeply tied into destiny. Your actions, both in this life and maybe past lives, are seen as directly shaping your future course. So the core insight here, I think, for many people is that destiny isn't just blind fate. It's more like a huge, intricate tapestry where maybe divine will and our own actions weave together. And that just brings up that fundamental question again. How much is already laid out and how much is genuinely up to us?
Right, that set versus open distinction feels really key. And it leads us nicely into the philosophical side of things because thinkers have been chewing on this for centuries. How do they usually frame this debate?
Philosophically, yeah, the conversation often boils down to two main camps. First, you've got determinism. This is the idea that every single event, including every human action, is completely determined by prior causes, like links in a chain. If you could theoretically know every single variable in the universe at one specific moment, well, you could predict its entire future. So in this view, destiny isn't some mystical force. It's just the unavoidable result of cause and effect, stretching all the way back to, the beginning of everything.
Okay, so pure determinism is like a giant, incredibly complex set of dominoes falling, each one triggering the next, inevitably.
Precisely. A perfect analogy. And then standing against that is the very powerful idea of free will. This belief insists that fundamentally we are free to choose. Our decisions, moment by moment, actually create our path as we go. The core idea here is that destiny, if it even exists in this view, isn't some endpoint waiting for us. It's more like a road we build ourselves step by step with our choices.
It makes me think of that quote, destiny is not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. So how do these philosophical views line up with what science generally says?
Well, generally speaking, science doesn't really back the idea of a predetermined destiny in that old school, unchangeable fate kind of way. What it does acknowledge is a really complex mix of things, probabilities, influencing factors, basic physical laws. And while our decisions are definitely shaped by tons of things, genetics, environment, past experiences, science generally leaves room for a component of, real freedom in human choices.
So maybe destiny isn't this fixed point we're all heading towards, but more like a potential direction or maybe a range of possibilities. And it's us, through our choices, who decide which way to go or maybe even forge a completely new path.
That kind of blended view is definitely one of the more compelling ways people try to square these different ideas. It allows for both external influences and our own agency.
Okay, let's dive deeper then into the science, particularly physics, because this is where things get really interesting when we talk about determinism and free will. I mean, our everyday world seems so predictable, right? The sun comes up, water boils, you drop something, it falls. These are the classical laws of physics we learn about.
They are indeed. Classical physics, the physics of Newton, and everyday objects suggest that everything, every particle even, follows a set trajectory. If you can know the exact starting conditions of a system, the precise position and speed of every piece in it, you could, in theory, calculate its entire past and future perfectly. So from this classical viewpoint, the whole universe looks like this incredibly huge, but ultimately understandable mechanism. True randomness just doesn't fit in.
It reminds me of the coin flip example. We think it's random, 50-50 heads or tails. But classical physics would say, if you knew everything, the force of the flip, the spin, the air resistance, all of it, you could actually predict the outcome before it lands. It only looks random because we don't have all that data.
Exactly right. And the implication there from pure classical physics is pretty staggering. If we are also just collections of particles obeying these laws, then our actions, our thoughts, even this feeling we have of choosing freely could just be an illusion. We'd just be, cogs in this giant cosmic machine. Our lives totally predetermined by whatever the universe started with. The kind of chilling insight here is that our sense of making choices might just be us experiencing a script that was written long ago.
Wow. Okay, so if that's the classical picture, is that the end of the story? Are we just sort of sophisticated puppets?
Not so fast. Things get much more complicated and, frankly, more interesting when we bring in quantum mechanics. But actually, before we even get to quantum, there's another wrinkle in the classical picture, chaos theory.
Ah, right, the butterfly effect. Where, like, a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could eventually cause a tornado in Texas? That idea?
That's the popular image, yeah. Chaotic systems are basically systems where incredibly tiny, almost immeasurable differences in the starting conditions can lead to wildly different outcomes down the line. Think of something like a double pendulum, two pendulums linked together. Even if you start them almost identically, their paths will diverge dramatically and unpredictably very quickly.
I remember hearing that historical analogy about Adolf Hitler being rejected from art school twice. A seemingly small event, right? But with potentially massive, unforeseen consequences for world history.
It's a really thought-provoking example of how small things can snowball. But, and this is crucial, even though chaotic systems are practically impossible for us to predict long-term, from a purely classical physics standpoint, they are still technically determined. There's still only one actual path the system follows. Our inability to predict it perfectly is down to our inability to measure those starting conditions with infinite precision. It doesn't mean the path wasn't set from the start. So the insight, even with chaos, is that in a classical universe, prediction might be impossible, but determinism could still hold true.
Okay, got it. So the classical world, even with its chaotic bits, still seems to lean towards a determined path. But you mentioned quantum mechanics. How does that change the game?
This is where things really get turned upside down. Around a century ago, physicists discovered that down at the very smallest scales, atoms, electrons, photons, the rules of classical physics just break. When you try to measure something tiny, like an electron's position, the act of measuring it actually changes its state, its momentum. You can't know both perfectly. And instead of following definite paths, these quantum particles exist in a state of probabilities. Quantum laws don't tell you where a particle is, they tell you the probability of finding it in various places if you look. The very foundation of reality at this level seems to be built on chance, on probability, not on fixed outcomes.
Whoa, that sounds like genuine randomness, which totally contradicts the classical deterministic picture. But hang on, if the universe is fundamentally random down there, how come our world, the big world we live in, seems so predictable and stable? My coffee cup doesn't just randomly decide to phase through the table.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer seems to involve something called decoherence. Think of it this way. A single quantum particle might behave in all sorts of weird probabilistic ways. But when you get trillions upon trillions of them interacting together, like in your coffee cup, their individual quantum fuzziness tends to average out. One particular outcome, usually the one that matches the classical prediction, becomes overwhelmingly probable, like 99.999% probable. So the system looks and acts as if it's following a completely determined classical path.
Ah, but the key word is looks. It's overwhelmingly probable, but not 100% guaranteed.
Exactly. It's not absolute certainty. Though the chances are mind-bogglingly tiny, it's technically possible within the laws of physics for a macroscopic object, like your toffee cup, to deviate slightly from its expected classical path due to underlying quantum effects. You'd probably have to watch it for longer than the age of the universe to see it happen, but the possibility isn't zero. So, for all practical purposes, our big world seems determined. But the fundamental reality underneath has this layer of inherent uncertainty.
So where does this leave our brains and our choices? Are we still locked in, or does quantum mechanics maybe crack open a door for real free will?
Well, that's still a huge area of debate. Our brains are warm, wet, complex systems with billions of interacting neurons. Many physicists think they probably act like classical decoherent systems. If that's the case, then even with quantum mechanics underneath, the brain's processes might still be effectively predetermined for all practical purposes. However, it's also possible that the brain is such a sensitive, maybe even chaotic system, that these tiny quantum fluctuations could get amplified and actually influence our neural firing patterns, our thoughts, and ultimately our decisions. Science doesn't have the final answer yet, but the really important takeaway from physics, I think, is that based on our current understanding of the fundamental laws, free will is perfectly possible. Physics doesn't forbid it.
Okay, so physics leaves the door open. What about neuroscience? It's also weighed in heavily on free will, sometimes with pretty controversial findings. Let's talk about that famous one, the Libet experiment.
Ah, yes. Benjamin Libet's experiment from the 1970s. It's definitely one of the most talked about studies in this area. So, Libet had volunteers hooked up to EEG machines to measure their brain activity. He asked them to do something really simple. Just flex their wrist whenever they felt the spontaneous urge to do so. And crucially, he asked them to watch a special clock and note the exact moment they first felt the conscious intention, the urge or decision to move.
Right. And what did he find when he compared the timing of the brain activity, the conscious urge, and the actual movement?
This was the bombshell finding. Libet discovered a specific pattern of brain activity, which he called the readiness potential. It's like your brain getting ready to initiate the movement, that started building up before the person reported feeling the conscious intention to move. This brain signal started about 300 milliseconds or so before the conscious awareness and about half a second before the actual wrist flex.
Wow. So the brain activity came first, and the common interpretation of that was pretty stark, right?
It was. Many people jumped on this and said, see, proof against free will. The argument was that your brain unconsciously decides to act first, and then your conscious mind just kind of catches up later and creates this illusion that you consciously chose to act. The stark insight for many was that our feeling of being in charge, our free will, might just be a story we tell ourselves after the fact.
But Libet himself, the guy who did the study, he didn't quite see it that way, did he?
No, interestingly, he didn't. Libet himself believed in something he called free won't, or the power of veto. He suggested that even if the brain initiates the process unconsciously, our conscious minds still have a small window of time, maybe the last couple hundred milliseconds before the movement, where it can step in and veto the action, stop it from happening. So for Libet, freedom wasn't necessarily in starting the action, but in the ability to consciously stop it.
Okay, that's a different spin. But what about the criticisms of the experiment itself? Because it's faced a lot of pushback over the years, hasn't it?
Well, absolutely. And the criticisms are pretty substantial. Philosophers and neuroscientists have pointed out several key issues. Firstly, the task was incredibly simple and, frankly, meaningless, just flexing your wrist whenever. Participants were explicitly told not to plan or think about it, just act spontaneously. That's a world away from the kind of complex, value-driven, significant decisions we usually associate with free will, like deciding who to marry, or what career path to take, or even just what to have for dinner after weighing options. The men's side is, maybe studying trivial urges doesn't tell us much about meaningful choices.
Right.
And secondly, there have been later studies that tried to address this. For instance, a study by Urima Mowles and colleagues in 2019 looked at decisions that actually mattered more to the participants. They worked with patients who had electrodes implanted for medical reasons, allowing more direct brain recording, and asked them to make decisions like which nonprofit organization to donate a significant sum of money to.
In those more meaningful decision scenarios, they didn't consistently find that same readiness potential reliably predicting the choice before the person was aware of making it.
That's a really important difference, suggesting the type of decision might fundamentally change how the brain handles it.
It really might. And a final major point is the difference between feeling an impulse and making a decision. Libet asked people to report when they felt the spontaneous urge to move. That readiness potential might just reflect the brain generating a random impulse, like feeling a sudden itch. It's not necessarily the decision to act on that impulse. The conscious choice might be in whether you choose to scratch the itch or flex the wrist or not. So putting all these criticisms together, many philosophers and scientists today argue that the Libet experiment is far from conclusive proof against free will or for total determinism. The key insight really is that measuring brain activity related to a spontaneous twitch might not capture the essence of conscious deliberation.
Fascinating stuff. It really highlights how tricky it is to scientifically pin down something like free will. So, moving beyond the lab, how have different cultures grappled with this idea of destiny?
Oh, culturally, the views are incredibly rich and varied. In Jewish tradition, for example, there's generally a strong emphasis on free will. Individuals are seen as having significant power to shape their own path, sometimes even seen as partners with God in shaping outcomes. Contrast that with, say, the Islamic concept of al-Qadr, which translates roughly to divine decree or predestination. The belief here is that everything that happens, good or bad, is ultimately part of God's plan and knowledge. It emphasizes trust and acceptance of what unfolds.
And then you have something like ancient Greek mythology, which often presented fate as this really powerful, inescapable force.
Absolutely. Think of the Moirai, or the fates Clotho, Lycussus, and Atropos. They were often depicted as weavers, literally spinning, measuring, and cutting the thread of every person's life. Their decrees were considered absolute, binding even on the gods sometimes. This idea of an unalterable, almost fatalistic destiny is a huge theme in Greek tragedy, like Oedipus Rex, where the hero tries desperately to escape his prophesied fate, but ultimately fulfills it precisely because of his attempts to avoid it. The powerful insight from that cultural perspective is this deep-seated human intuition, in some cultures at least, that maybe our lives are fundamentally scripted.
So bringing it back to us, to you listening, how does believing or not believing in destiny actually affect us psychologically? What does psychology tell us?
That's where the concept of locus of control comes in, which is a really useful idea from psychology. People with a strong internal locus of control tend to believe that they are primarily in charge of their own lives. They think their actions and decisions directly shape their outcomes, their destiny. This mindset is generally linked with positive things: greater resilience in the face of setbacks, higher self-esteem, feeling more empowered and proactive. The insight is clear. Believing you're the driver, not a passenger, tends to be psychologically beneficial.
Okay. And the flip side would be an external locus of control.
Exactly. People with a strong external locus of control tend to attribute what happens to them to outside forces: luck, chance, powerful others, or indeed fate or destiny. While sometimes accepting external factors is realistic, a very strong external locus can lead to its fatalism. Fatalism is basically the belief that events are predetermined and there's nothing you can really do to change them. This can, unfortunately, lead to feelings of helplessness, resignation, sometimes even depression or anxiety. If you feel like nothing you do matters, why bother trying? So the psychological insight is that a strong belief in an external, unchangeable destiny can be quite disempowering.
So it sounds like the sweet spot, psychologically, might be finding that balance, accepting that some things are outside our control, sure, but really focusing our energy and belief on the areas where our choices do make a difference, knowing where our agency really matters.
That seems like a very healthy approach. And it contrasts sharply with another perspective, a rather stark one, from the scientist Jacques Monod in his famous book Chance and Necessity. Monod argued, quite forcefully, that life itself, including human existence, is essentially the result of random cosmic accidents, pure chance, interacting with the impersonal laws of physics necessity. His view suggests the universe is fundamentally indifferent to us, to our hopes, our suffering. There's no inherent meaning or purpose, no divine script, no pre-established destiny guiding us. This perspective completely challenges the idea of a guiding hand or a higher plan. It basically says the universe doesn't care. And the invitation from that view is, therefore, it's up to us to create our own meaning, our own purpose within this indifferent cosmos. The powerful, if maybe unsettling insight from Monod is, if destiny isn't given to us, we have to make it ourselves.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here. From ancient spiritual beliefs and philosophical debates to cutting-edge physics and neuroscience, trying to get a handle on this huge question of destiny versus free will. We've seen ideas about predetermined paths set by classical physics, challenged by the randomness of quantum mechanics. We've looked at divine plans and karma, contrasted with the starkness of pure chance. We've considered brain signals that might precede choice, and the profound cultural and psychological impacts of believing one way or the other. It's definitely clear there's no single, simple answer that satisfies everyone or every perspective.
Absolutely not. And maybe connecting all these threads leads us to a really important question to ponder. If our most fundamental physics seems to allow for possibility, for chance, making free will physically plausible, and if neuroscience, despite experiments like Lipit's, hasn't definitively ruled out meaningful choice, especially when things matter, then what do we make of our own powerful, persistent feeling of being free, this subjective sense that we're making choices? Is that feeling just a convincing illusion cooked up by our brains, as some interpretations suggest? Or could it be a genuine reflection of our actual capacity for agency, for self-determination within this complex universe? That, I think, remains one of the deepest questions.
It really does. Ultimately, whether you find yourself leaning more towards a sense of a predetermined path unfolding or towards a feeling of wide open choices yet to be made, thinking through all these different angles, the spiritual, philosophical, the scientific, the psychological, it definitely deepens our understanding of ourselves, doesn't it? And maybe helps us appreciate our place, whatever it might be, in this vast, amazing, and often unpredictable universe. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to our next episode.